If we open up the Bible today, I want us to look at the Gospel of Luke. I want to read to you today from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. So let us listen to the words of Luke. Someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me as judge or referee between you and your brother?" Then Jesus said to them, "Watch out. Guard yourself against all kinds of greed. After all, one's life isn't determined by one's possessions, even when someone is very wealthy." Then he told them a parable. A certain rich man's land produced a bountiful crop. He said to himself, "What will I do? I have no place to store my harvest." Then he thought, "Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. That's where I'll store all my grain and goods. I'll say to myself, 'You have stored up plenty of goods, enough for several years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself.' But God said to him, 'Fool, tonight you will die. Now who will get these things you have prepared for yourself? This is the way it will be for those who hoard things for themselves and aren't rich toward God.'" In the story today, the text we have, the bigger context is that Jesus is speaking to a large crowd of people. Because back in verse 1 of chapter 12, the chapter starts out by saying, when a crowd of thousands upon thousands had gathered so that they were crushing each other, Jesus began to speak. So that's what's going on. There's a whole bunch of people who've come out to hear what Jesus has to say. And as he is talking to the crowd, a man speaks up and asks Jesus to talk to his brother about sharing an inheritance. The family was squabbling about money, about an estate. And I'll tell you, if you've ever been around a family fight over money or an estate, that can be nasty stuff. And if you notice, Jesus didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And yet Jesus did give a warning, and he told a story. So that's what I want us to look at today, the warning and the story. First of all, the warning. Verse 15, Jesus said to them, to the whole crowd of thousands there, "Watch out. Guard yourself against all kinds of greed. After all, one's life isn't determined by one's possession, even when someone is very wealthy." Watch out, Jesus said, about greed. Greed is talked about a lot in the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. When you think back to the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, we have as the foundation of Jewish law the Ten Commandments, right? And one of those Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 says, "Thou shalt not covet." Covet is the same as greed. Depending what translation of the Bible you're using, the two words are used interchangeably, covetousness or greed. So one of the 10 pillars of the Jewish law tells us that we should not be greedy. Jesus talks about this a lot. He talks about money. He talks about the disparity between the rich and the poor. For example, in Luke chapter 6, verse 20, Jesus was preaching a sermon, and he said, "Blessed are the poor." And then a few verses later, in verse 24, he says, "And woe to the rich." In Luke chapter 19, Jesus tells a story about two men. One he simply calls the rich man, and the other one he calls Lazarus. And he tells us in this story that the rich man was really blind to this beggar Lazarus. The rich man had it made. He was enjoying the good life. But Lazarus was there with him, but he was blind to Lazarus. Jesus is talking about how people who have can be blind to those who have not. And then Jesus illustrates how God thinks about that in this story, because he says when the two men die, their position in the next life is turned around. The rich man is in torment, but Lazarus, the poor beggar, is now blessed in the life to come. And then there's another story in Luke chapter 19, where Jesus encounters a tax collector, and Luke tells us that he was a rich man. His name was Zacchaeus. And when he encountered Jesus, his life was changed. And he said to Jesus, he said, "Whatever wealth I have acquired, I'm going to give half of it to the poor." And he says, if I have defrauded anybody in anything in my business dealings, and I find out about it, I will pay them back 4 times. And Jesus said to him, today, salvation has come to your house. Paul, when he was writing to the churches in his letters, talked about greed. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul warns that greed is idolatry. Greed can become our God. Well, what is greed? When you look at the biblical idea of greed, there's really 2 things that come across. You go back to the 10 Commandments. When it says, do not covet, what the 10 Commandments is saying is that we should not desire that which belongs to somebody else. We should not be consumed with desire for what somebody else has. And then the idea of greed also carries with it the idea of accumulating more for yourself than that which you really need. In our story today, the word in this translation is the word hoard. That's hoarding, acquiring for yourself more than what you need. So those are the ideas of the biblical idea of greed. And so we have this story today that Jesus tells as he's dealing with the subject of greed. And he tells a story about a wealthy farmer. And he says this wealthy farmer has had so much of a harvest that he doesn't know where to put everything. And so he wonders what to do. And so he asks himself what he's going to do. And he decides, well, what I'll do is I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns. And then he's so happy about what he's been able to accomplish, he says, man, I'm going to take it easy. You know, it's time to eat and drink and enjoy life. But then God has something to say. God calls him a fool and says, tonight you're going to die. And then who's going to have this stuff? You know, you look at the farmer in this story, that as Jesus tells the story, and it doesn't appear that he was cheating anybody. It doesn't appear that he was doing anything illegal or immoral. He was successful. And when you look at that, I mean, don't we all want to be that way? I mean, I kind of want to be like that farmer. You know, I want to be able to have enough that I don't have to worry. I mean, don't all of us want to be content and retire without worrying about how we're going to pay for things? I kind of want to be like that rich farmer, and you probably do too. And so, what's the problem? I think if we look a little closer to the story, Jesus shares several things that I think tells us what the problem is. First of all, Jesus points out that this man is very self-centered. Let's go back and look at how he describes this man, beginning in verse 17. The farmer said to himself, "What will I do? I have no place to store my harvest." Then he thought, here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. That's where I'll store my grain and goods. I'll say to myself, you have stored up plenty of goods, enough for several years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. You see, it's I, my, mine. Jesus is painting a word picture here of somebody who is extremely egocentric. I think even narcissistic. Now, we talk a lot about how we need to have healthy self-esteem, and we should. We ought to feel good about ourselves. We ought to take care of ourselves. We ought to love ourselves. There is a healthy self-love. We call that healthy self-esteem, and that's good. We should be that way. But yet when we take that to an extreme, that can become selfish, egocentric. And that's what narcissism means. And so here's a picture of a narcissistic man. And if you notice, he doesn't consult God about what he's to do with all these possessions. He talks to who? Himself. You know, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. So he doesn't talk to God, he talks to himself. And Jesus tells stories in such a great way. And in the irony of the story, even though the man is talking to himself and not to God, God speaks. And God says something to the man that the man had never thought about. And frankly, that he didn't want to hear. So we have, first of all, a picture of a man who is extremely self-centered. And the second thing that Jesus points out in this story is he reminds us that we are stewards and not owners. Down in verse 20, but God said to him, "Fool, tonight you will die. Now who will get the things you have prepared for yourself?" The Bible uses the word steward often. It is a Bible word. It's a church word. I don't hear really anybody out in society ever use the word steward anymore. We used to have stewardesses on airlines, but we call them what now? We call them something else. Flight attendants. Yeah, they're flight attendants, not stewardesses anymore. So what is a steward or a stewardess? Well, a steward is somebody who is taking care of that which belongs to someone else. And in the Bible, again, Old Testament and New Testament, the Bible teaches that God as creator owns it all. We don't really own anything. And what's the proof of that? Well, Jesus points it out in this story. When you die, what's going to happen to all that stuff? All these things that mean so much to me, that I've acquired during my life, what's going to happen the minute that I die? Can't take it with me, right? Somebody else is going to have to fool with it. I'm gone. It's gone. So stewardship is realizing that we really don't own anything. This stuff that we have is only being loaned to us from God, and God is expecting us to use it in that way. And so Jesus is reminding us that we don't own anything. We are stewards of that which we have. And then there's one other thing in this story that Jesus tells us. Down in the very last verse, when he talks about we ought not to hoard things, he says we need to be rich toward God. Now, I wonder what that means. What do you think that means? When Jesus says we should be rich toward God, what's he talking about there? Well, when you think about the things that Jesus taught about, he says the most important commandment is that we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that must be what he means when he talks about being rich toward God. Paul, when he was writing to the church in Galatians, was talking about how we have God's Spirit in our life, the Holy Spirit, which just really means God is present with us, and we realize that. And he says when God is present with us, then our life is going to bear fruit. Paul calls this the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 and 23. And here's what he says that fruit will be in our lives when we're enjoying the presence of God: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. He says that's what's going to come from your life when you are living in the presence of God, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus said in John chapter 10 and verse 10, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. This is the abundant life that he's talking about, a life that is rich toward God. I believe what Jesus is doing is he's calling us to a radical redirection of our lives. He's calling us away from things to be rich toward God. And when we are rich toward God, then we will view things differently. And we will see people in a different way. And all of God's people said, will you pray with me?